Hello, everyone. My name is Mr. Jennings. You might not have me as your WAP teacher, but a project that I'm going to be working on kind of on my own this year is creating video lectures that go through the AMSCO notes and the AMSCO textbook in a way that's a little bit more manageable for a few reasons. To model the notes in a way that makes you feel more comfortable as you address them, as well as providing a scaffold or support for you guys, maybe when you feel overwhelmed or are unable to finish the reading notes in the way that we ask. Your teachers are all going to have an independent policy with how to use these videos, but also they're at the bare minimum a really helpful review tool to hear the content as opposed to reading it, or to hear the content in a different way than how you may have heard it from your other teachers, right? So this is always going to exist as a supplement. And we're going to start with 1.1, which covers developments in East Asia. Okay? And these should be about a 15-minute video. It's not a replacement for reading, but it is something that can be supportive if necessary. So, first thing is I have the vocabulary. This is something you want to take note of. Pause me to take down all of these. You won't have access to the PowerPoint. So the only way to really see these notes is to watch the videos on YouTube. So pause me. There are 2 pages of vocabulary. So, yeah. Okay, and let's get started. So our first subtopic or topic in this, subtopic, because, the chapters are called topics here, are talking about governmental developments in Song Dynasty China. So we've probably already contextualized some things about China in class, but something that's really important to keep in mind when we talk about the dynasties of China. We say the Song Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty or the Qin Dynasty or Qing Dynasty. Those are all governing a single state that was continuous for thousands of years. And that state's called China, which means Middle Kingdom. That the Chinese people saw themselves as the center of the world in a lot of ways. So the Song Dynasty is in charge of China for most of the period that we're going to talk about, from period 1, 1200 to 1450. At the tail end of the 14th century, a new dynasty comes to power. That's a Yuan Dynasty, and that's a set and going to be in Unit 2. So don't worry about that yet. But some things to note about Song Dynasty China is that it was smaller than the previous China, specifically the Tang Dynasty that came before it was the biggest China had been yet. But even though it was smaller, it was more densely populated. And we'll talk about that a lot with the economic manifestations of China in the next slide. So a really important political development in Song China was this continuity, this thing that stayed the same pretty much since the Han Dynasty in the late BC, so the late BCEs, like the 200 BC, around the time in Europe, the Roman Empire is in power. And that is the idea of a bureaucracy. So in a bureaucracy, people are appointed to do jobs in the government. And this appointment system was determined through a pretty distinct system of using an exam. There are announcements. Well, I'm going to pause this for a second. We just had some of those terse announcements you guys had on the Wednesday of the first week of school. So I was saying a bureaucracy is where someone's appointed to do a job, to do governmental jobs, as opposed to an aristocracy where someone is given a job in the government based on their birthright. Who is decided to do a job in a bureaucracy is typically determined by merit, what I mean by that is ability. So you would take a test in China, and based on how you performed in that test, you would be determined to have a certain ability, right? And that ability would then get you a job in the government to do things. So say if you did really good on the test, you'd be in charge of a province. But if you did good on the test, but not the best, you might be assigned to look over a municipality or a town or a city. So in general, that means that if someone has the capacity through their genes to be intelligent in the way that the test assessed intelligence, you could be born in a hovel and have a really bad life and still have success in the future. That is what a meritocracy is. However, the test was over a very specific set of documents, mostly focused on Confucian thought. And if you could afford a tutor who could teach you kind of the ins and outs of the test, your success was more certain, which means that having resources or families having resources made people perform better on tests. So while at least nominally it looks like people were able to succeed based on their ability, it also was less socially mobile than it seems at first. Now, the economic slide is going to be the longest slide of this video. I kind of moved out of the way, and you can tell how tiny it is, right? So keep in mind, you're always writing the gist down at the beginning of a unit. So the Grand Canal is a really important logistical and infrastructural achievement of China. It would start in the Tang Dynasty, but really finalized during the Song Dynasty. And it was a series of artificial rivers that the Chinese government created to expedite the transport of people and goods between communities, right? So when you think about moving goods, putting goods on a boat, you can put way more things in a boat and send it down the canal, as opposed to land-based travel where using wagons or sleds or even just carrying something means you're carrying a lot less. So the Grand Canal system allowed China to have a larger economy to scale than any kind of system that was land-based, okay? Gunpowder was a technology that is going to be really important in a few centuries, but at this point, firearms were invented in China, and gunpowder itself spread along the Silk Road, and the potential of gunpowder was immediately apparent to most people, but then it wasn't really refined and finalized into the most significant kind of weapon of human history, guns. And I'll fight someone on that. Guns are probably the most important military invention in human history. So guns travel and they start in China. Agricultural productivity expands mainly through the distribution of what's a strain of rice called champa rice, which champa is an area in Southeast Asia. And why champa rice is cool is that it grows really fast and it actually is really environmentally resistant. So champa rice can be grown twice a year, where normal pre-existing strains of rice can only be grown once a year. So essentially, champa rice doubled the agricultural productivity of an area. Just by growing champa rice, you grew twice as much rice. And that surplus, and also the environmental resistances of champa rice, allowed rice to be grown in more diverse places. So more land could be farmed, and then more food could be grown in that land throughout a calendar year. They also used manure. And the population growth of China is immense during this period. It goes from being a quarter of the human population to 40% during the Song Dynasty. And that is only possible when a food surplus is occurring, right? Because when people can't make enough food to feed themselves consistently, they're not thinking about having children, right? Or that's not a thing that's even viable. The Chinese also developed systems of manufacturing, and trade expands as well. So a big issue with the Tang Dynasty that preceded, that's the term, the Song Dynasty was the Tang Dynasty. And even though these urban areas were growing and it was a very big empire, you need fuel to mainly, heat your homes, but also some industrial processes use fire, and the more productive processes used that, the more they had to use fuel. But wood was the primary fuel before coal, and coal is essentially really, really old wood in some cases, right? Because it's fossil, and the chemical potential energy of coal is more than what's in wood. So coal burns longer and hotter. So using coal allowed the Song economy to heat homes more efficiently, but also use fire in productive processes more effectively. They didn't have steam power, though, that comes in the 19th century, the 18th century in Europe. Also through coal, one of those industrial processes that is abetted or helped by coal would be the manufacture of steel. So steel is a composite of carbon and iron folded together in a way, and you need a lot of heat to do that. And so you can do that with burning wood. It's just way more inefficient. You're burning a lot of wood to create steel, where coal makes that more effective. And so the consequence of this food surplus and these new industrial processes is what is called proto-industrialization by AMSCO. Because you could make more food, you had less people who needed to work in farming. And because less people needed to work in farming, they could find other jobs to make things. And that's where a class of artisans were made. And so more people are making things like pottery, dishware, baskets. Those are some examples of goods that now people can spend a lifetime refining and perfecting how they make, and then selling those products. The Chinese also developed the compass and used it. And the compass is pretty straightforward. If you know where you're going, you know where north is, then you know where east, west, and south are, which means you can find where you are if you need to go east to find a community. And the biggest consequence of this proto-industrialization process is that the Song Chinese people have more disposable income, and therefore they spend it on things, right? So you even have a proto-commercial or consumer-based culture that's going to be really prevalent in industrial societies, right? That's why it's called proto-industrialism. So the Song Dynasty also taxed their people, and they taxed what was produced, and they used the resources from taxation, either taxing goods in kind, so taxing farmers and what they grew, or taxing potters and what pots they made, and then selling those goods. They might even resort to currency-based taxation, where you would take, they would have to pay a fee, like what we do today every year in the present day in America, to the government, where they pay their taxes. And because the government had so many more resources, they could fund infrastructure projects and their expansion, like making the Grand Canal more effective. And finally, the economic developments of Song China, they continued using the system called tribute. So China was a really powerful state. It used that influence to extract favorable trade agreements from neighboring governments in exchange for a promise of protection. And that was part of this promise of protection was this ritual called kowtowing, where you would have to act in extreme deference to the Chinese emperor by, for example, bowing your head so low to the ground your forehead was touching it, to show how much more powerful, influential the Chinese emperor was. Next slide, we have our social structures in China. Something that developed in China and East Asia that is unique to East Asia in many ways, and Southeast Asia, was the development of a scholar gentry. So this idea of a meritocracy and this idea of a civil service exam means that there is a way for you to find success in life without having some of the things that would be hallmarks of success in other parts of the world, like owning land. So a scholar gentleman, or a member of the scholar gentry, would maybe not own a lot of land, but have a lot of influence and wealth because of the position they had been afforded by their performance on the civil service exam. So these people would maybe own homes, they would be bureaucrats, they might even be business owners and entrepreneurs, because the civil service exam prepared them to be business owners and entrepreneurs in general Chinese society. So these people were separate from peasants and aristocrats. They weren't landowners in the same sense. They didn't have people work the land. They didn't produce in that same way. And in most ways, farmers, artisans, and merchants were below the scholar gentry. But in a lot of ways, the scholar gentry was parallel or below the aristocracy, depending on what part of China we're talking about. Merchants were interestingly kind of isolated from Chinese society. They were seen as even less than farmers, because they were seen as people who just profited off the hard work of other people. They were middlemen in the commercial process. They were they got the producers goods to the consumer, and that was not a very honorable profession, because if the producer had the time, they would just sell their stuff, right? So peasants are also separate from farmers in that farmers are typically people who own the land and then work that land themselves, where peasants were people who would rent land or work that land as laborers for an aristocrat. So a farmer who does really well could eventually start paying people and they could become an aristocrat and stuff like that. But typically aristocrats are the people who aren't doing any kind of farming, where like a farmer might own the land they work on and then do that stuff with it too. For women, China was a patriarchy, which means that men had a lot of influence in the public sphere and that women typically had influence limited to the domestic sphere inside of the home. Wealthy families used a practice called foot binding, which becomes a status symbol of a woman having their feet bound when they were younger to limit their growth to make them small, which conformed to a Chinese standard of beauty, but also exerted a type of control over the autonomy of women. Because these women had small feet, they couldn't move very quickly, often had to move with the assistance of a cane, which means that they were restricted to the home. They really couldn't leave the home very much. So these women lived very sheltered lives, and they might have a lot of influence in that life, in that part of the experience, but also they were physically constrained from doing anything but that. And this was a practice restricted only for wealthy women. Some intellectual cultural developments that were a part of China were that woodblock printing makes printing and makes literacy more accessible, right? So before you have printing, the only way you disseminate writing is through copying it by hand. And it's a very laborious process, right? Because copying takes roughly as long as it takes to write something down, right? Because someone writes it down, it takes a minute to write that sentence. Someone looks at the sentence, write it down, it takes a minute as well, right? Not including all the pre-writing and planning in a writing thing, right? I'm maybe being facetious. So woodblock printing is you have a page, you have a collection of wood blocks in a tray, you would arrange the wood blocks with the right characters to mirror the written page, you'd coat that tray of wood blocks with ink, and then you'd stamp that on typically paper. Because paper was another type of writing implement or writing tool that was different than pre-existing systems, which were like sometimes wax tablets or stone tablets that would be like when clay would be wet, you'd carve in the symbols and then bake it to make it permanent. Wax as well would be like a soft material that could be manipulated. But paper is lighter than both clay, wax, or stone. And so you can carry a lot more information. You almost think about the process of hard drives, right? The earliest hard drives, which were like 50 megabytes, were the size of the TVs we have in our classrooms. And now 50 megabytes is, the teeny part of the smallest of thumb drives. And that's a difference. So paper, you can have a stack of papers that weigh the same as a stone tablet, but you can have probably hundreds or several hundred times the amount of information on a page of paper than you could have on a tablet of clay. Because reading and because the supply of reading materials increases, reading becomes more accessible. Reading becomes cheaper, right? You'd only copy something down when you had wax, clay, or stone when you needed to copy it down. Paper means anyone can kind of write on it because paper is kind of like super cheap in a way. So there's a lot more written down. And that means a lot more reasons to learn how to read. And lots of people do learn how to read, even though Chinese is a very difficult language because unlike written English, which is a phonetic language where we have our symbols represent sounds, Chinese language is character-based, which means that ideas or even words have a single symbol. And often sentences or complex ideas are composites of simpler symbols, right? So reading becomes more accessible, and a well-read person is regarded as a Confucian ideal. All right, and then we're going into our final. We have one more slide after this. 2 more slides. This is going to be one of the longer videos because it's such a dense topic. So when the AMSCO talks about religious diversity in China, they're mostly talking about Buddhism and how Buddhism interacts with China or in East Asia. So Buddhism comes to China via the Silk Road in a long time, probably in the 500-600 CE is when Buddhism's getting there. It was kind of prevalent in West China and kind of moved eastward and eastward and eastward. There are 2 kinds of Buddhism, 2 big branches of Buddhism and 1 smaller branch of Buddhism. So Theravadan Buddhism is really popular in Southeast Asia, like in Vietnam, modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos. And that's focusing on spiritual growth through meditation and self-discipline. Mahayana Buddhism is focused on a larger understanding of spiritual growth through all beings. And that's the part of Buddhism that got really popular in China. Chan Buddhism is known as also Zen Buddhism, and that assimilates Taoism or Taoism, depending on if those spellings are corrected with a D or a T. And Taoism means the way. And so these two religions have a lot in common. And so Zen Buddhism kind of mixes them together, uses Buddhist terms for Taoist ideas and Taoist terms for Buddhist ideas. Tibetan Buddhism, sorry, I skipped that. It's very specific that they include this, but it's a type of Buddhism that's focused on chanting, shoulder shrug on that. There's a kind of somewhat different pantheon of not deities, but figures in Tibetan Buddhism that's not necessarily common in Mahayana or Theravadan Buddhism. Just some context about Buddhism is that Buddhism was really big in China during the Tang Dynasty and led to the Buddhist monasteries and Buddhist leaders having a lot of influence in Chinese politics and economics and culture, which in the Tang Dynasty, who took away those monasteries and limited, and from then on, Buddhism was important in China, but not as important as it was in the Tang Dynasty. The Song are more okay with it. A big part of Confucianism is something called filial piety. A way I always think about it is piety is like a faith or a belief in, and filial is from the Latin root for like son. So it's the faith of the son. It's the like a son as like a child to someone. And I think that's always a really good way to break it down because filial piety focuses on the paternalistic relationship. What relationship a father has with a son, what relationship a ruler has with his people, framed as a relationship as a father and a son. Like the relationship is a parental relationship in Confucianism, and that's what filial piety is. Confucians react to the popularity of Buddhism, and they create a reaction. And that movement of Buddhism, and that in Confucianism, is called Neo-Confucianism. And it's more focused on the physical world because Buddhism's so focused on the spiritual world. So we try to say, like, you can be Buddhist, but also Buddhism's kind of esoteric. It's kind of ethereal. Let me talk to you guys about very specific problems and things that affect you every single day. So the final part of AMSCO for this chapter compares Japan, China, Korea, and Vietnam. We spend a lot of time on Japan. So Japan is interesting because Japan had a way to throttle their relationship with China, which means that they could scale up or scale down the amount of influence or interactions that China had with them, which means that they were less influenced by China in various periods in their history. So they did become more Buddhist, but instead of Confucianism being integrating with Buddhism, Shinto, which is an indigenous religion in Japan, also becomes prevalent. And then during this Heian period, they want to be more like China. So that's like a deviation from this larger theme. Japan still has a distinct cultural expression. For example, what is regarded often as the first novel in human history is The Tale of Genji, which is a Japanese story about a Japanese prince. And another interesting thing is that Japan is decentralized, that even though there was a central government led by a god emperor, they were not, that this emperor had religious and cultural significance, but didn't have very much political influence. And so the kind of more substantial or significant political division in Japan are called the daimyo. And these daimyo were landowning aristocrats who answered to a larger person like a shogun or an emperor, but if they didn't want to, they could really pressure the daimyo this emperor to kind of give them what they wanted. And so these daimyo often competed with each other for land and control. And it was a type of feudalism that we'll spend a lot of time in class talking about, in that European feudalism has a lot of similarities. So, for example, both did not have a lot of social mobility in that what station you were born in, you stayed in. If you were a daimyo, you were a daimyo. If you were a peasant, you were going to stay a peasant. The daimyo had more influence in European feudalism. Monarchs or kings had a lot more influence on these knights and rulers. And then they also had a behavior code that governed how they were to act. In Europe, it was called chivalry or the code of chivalry, and Japanese was called bushido or the way of the warrior. And then finally, it was something we already talked about, that Japan was decentralized and China was centralized. The final two things we're going to talk about are Korea and Vietnam. So Korea is interesting because it's a very small peninsula that historically has been very, its only country it borders is China. It was a more centralized government modeled in the style of China. It was more Buddhist, but also had Confucian influenced. And at first, it used the Confucian the Chinese writing system. Sorry, guys. But then made a cooler, a better writing system that was about, I think it's like 14 characters, and made literacy way more attainable in Korea. In fact, literacy was a part of Korea generally far sooner than it was in any other part in the world because of how simple and straightforward the written language of Korea is. Now, they also had a landed aristocracy. They had less scholar gentry. The civil service exam was close to the peasants, which equated to even less social mobility. And then final slide for this video would be gender and social structure. Vietnamese women exercised far more independence. The nuclear family was a more consistent organization. So that meant that like the husband, the wife, because most of these families are hetero. It's going to be heterosexual families. In fact, it'd be a very common. It would be a huge deviation for any kind of homosexual relationship to be like have a family, right? So we're talking about men and women having their children, living away from extended families, and that's still a part of Vietnamese culture to this day. They had a scholar gentry that was closer to the peasantry and acted as representatives of the peasantry and often revolted against the Vietnamese government if they weren't meeting the needs of peasants. And they liked women to not have bound feet and emphasized monogamous relationships. And they also were able to effectively resist China militarily several times in their history. So that's our first video on 1.1. Most of them will not be this long. The Dar al-Islam video will be much shorter than this one. But thank you guys, and I hope this helps you guys. Have a good day.